This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
All right, well, we're back on here for another week of wrestling talk. What's going on, everyone? Happy Flag Day, I guess. I know I completely undersold that holiday plug. As if anybody actually cares about Flag Day. It's like when they try to get me to care about June being Pride Month. Doesn't affect my life in any way. If y'all think it's worth celebrating, have at it. Good on you. I personally don't care. Not my flavor of style, if you know what I mean. But whatever you celebrate out there, don't let it get in the way of what's real important in this world. And that's every day. Because you never know when it could all be over. I know Dusty Rhodes infamously said, "It will never be over." But, unfortunately, reality is reality. Try to take life one step at a time and don't take anything for granted, especially as you get older. That's your life hack from random dude on the internet in his mid-30s who's still trying to navigate this painful world. So we're here for a Monday podcast. That means it's Retro Raw discussion time here on the Five Starr Wrestling Report. The wrestling podcast nobody knows but everyone needs. Thanks to everybody that comes to check out the show every week. Or if you happen to be a new viewer watching for the first time, make sure you subscribe, comment, and leave a like for me down below. You can find us on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for classic wrestling coverage of WWF, WCW, and Mid-South Wrestling. And we are making a fairly significant dent in the archived library of all these programs. Happy to see I've managed to commit at least full-time to all the classic content we've dealt with over the last several years. With the exception of World Class, which unfortunately I just completely lost interest in and didn't have enough time to even keep that blocked out for the Friday show. Other than that, we've made good progress. Well, it's been tough to sift through a lot of this WWF content in particular. It has been quite fascinating reliving this Retro Raw timeline. Seeing a lot of this stuff again makes me... Well, for one, it makes me realize why I was more interested in WCW's product around this time. And why everything WWF related for me was either taped or completely forgotten about. It was such a bizarre time to be a wrestling fan in school because, well, for the people my age, you know what I'm talking about. It was a really divided culture back then, man. It's like the political landscape we see today between Republicans and Democrats. There was no middle ground when I was growing up. You were either a WWF fan or a WCW fan. Even if you watched both products, which I did, you still had to kind of pick and choose a side. I was on the bandwagon of Nitro. I mean, you all know this. That was my bread and butter during this era. And then about a year or so later from this point, the dynamic had completely flipped on its face. And from 98 onward, Nitro was the show I was putting on the back burner and recording to watch days later because the product was insufferably bad. But that's the kind of crap we had to deal with growing up. And speaking of crap, I think it's time we segue into this Retro Raw discussion. Before we get into the rundown, a couple little business items we need to address first. Not the least of which was the big fight that went down on Raw the other week. And for anyone not attuned to the locker room drama going on during this time, I'm talking about the fight that spilled out between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels before they even went on air. It was a fight that was not actually a pre-planned angle for the regular show. It was one of them shoot fights, as we insiders like to coin. Now, of course, with everything that happened as a result of the fight, they had to shift gears and completely rearrange the tag title picture. They also had to go out of their way to kayfabe what actually happened in that fight, is to not make Shawn Michaels look like well, for lack of better terms, a complete pussy. The reality is that Shawn pretty much got his ass beat. Bret did not really have to do a whole lot to rough him up. But of course, in their efforts to make it seem like Shawn actually put up a fight of his own, JR and Vince said that they're both currently nursing injuries. Bret's previously injured leg is now hurt again, but he'll be back within a few days. Shawn, on the other hand, is expected to be out of action for 4 to 6 weeks with an injured leg and a supposedly injured neck. They also forgot to mention a potentially injured scalp from that giant clump of hair that Bret pulled out. The one that wound up on Vince's desk when Shawn went in to confront him. And then Jim Cornette ended up taking it and bringing it home as a souvenir. Pro wrestling, everybody. Ain't it great? I'm not making that up, by the way. That is a true story. Shawn and Bret had their altercation. Bret beat the piss out of Shawn with minimal effort. Shawn then barged into Vince's office to complain about this being an unsafe work environment. He slammed the wad of hair on Vince's desk. And then he left. And when I say left, I mean, he legitimately walked out. He no-showed Raw, took his ball, and went home. Again. So now, as a result of them having to change up their tag team title scene, they're hosting a tournament to determine number one contenders, with the winners getting to challenge Austin and a partner of his choosing. Literally, all of that is now taking place simply because Bret and Shawn couldn't keep their egos in check. I also like how Vince had to point the finger of blame at Bret and say that he was the instigator in all this. Right. Yeah, with Shawn's reputation during this time, he was the innocent bystander in all this. I believe that like I believe a Hulk Hogan story. Subject to discrepancy. So we open Raw this week with Austin coming down to rage about the whole concept of this tournament. Called Vince into the ring to basically tell him, I don't need a tag partner. I never needed a tag team partner. And this whole thing is bogus. And so that led to Mankind showing up on the Jumbotron to tell Austin that they could make a perfect team. In fact, his words were pretty much as follows. Last week you flipped me the bird when I tried to extend the offer, and it was in that moment that I knew we had chemistry. He also said that he's prettier than Shawn Michaels because in addition to his long scraggly hair, he also has a nice ass. Okay then. And so eventually he told Austin to think about it. That led to Vince bringing up Austin's match later in the night with Brian Pillman, which they were supposed to have last week, but they ended up doing an angle where the Hart Foundation jumped Austin before the bell. That led to the giant schmoz where we got another Russo booking classic, where during the heat of battle, we had Mankind and Ken Shamrock both attempting to run in to make the save. And after the alleged babyfaces ran off the opposition, it ended with Austin laying out Shamrock with a stunner. Because as you know, when it comes to Vince Russo logic, nobody can be friends. Everybody must hate each other, including when it comes to babyfaces liking other babyfaces. Nope. Everybody's out for themselves. Everybody's a complete dick. So that led to this week. Oh, actually, before that, I want to mention this briefly because this is great. While Austin was in the middle of recapping what happened during that brawl the other week, he tries to put over how he's going to flush Brian Pillman's head down the commode and do this, that, and the other thing to him. Vince proceeded to then, in the middle of Austin's tirade, he pulled the mic away from him so he could talk about Ken Shamrock. The look on Austin's face in that moment is he burned a hole through Vince. Seriously, I thought he was going to lay him out with a stunner right there. He looked at Vince like, you motherfucker. You did not just pull the mic away from me mid-promo. And, well, because they needed to cram in more shit in this segment, out comes Shamrock to confront Austin. And you know how I've mentioned, like, I don't know, 57 times in the last 2 months that Shamrock was never a particularly great promo, and that keeping the mic away from him at all times was probably a wise decision? Well, they tried to let Shamrock talk here. It went about as you would have expected. In his attempts at sounding badass and serious, he told Austin that he reminds him exactly of the Hart Foundation. He's a bully. And Shamrock doesn't like bullies because they're mean. And then after challenging Austin to a match right then and there, Austin told him he was going to beat up Pillman first, and then he would kick Shamrock's little four-leaf clover later on. No idea what the hell that was supposed to mean. Oh, I also forgot to mention that Austin-Pillman match for later on. It is being billed as a regular singles match with all members of the Hart Foundation handcuffed to the ring post. So in other words, instead of simply barring them from being at ringside at all, they're still going to get to be within close proximity of the ring, just handcuffed. Because that seems coherent to the people booking the show. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong there? Aside from everything. We then followed that with a Brian Pillman promo where he talked about getting swirly by Austin at the King of the Ring. Then he said that the biggest mistake the bookers made was by deciding to handcuff all the members of the Hart Foundation at ringside, except for the actual convicted felon, the one who should be in cuffs already. I think what he meant to say was, the biggest mistake the bookers made was by adding this dumb stipulation at all. But that would be too logical for a heel to mention. Especially for a guy like Pillman. Then we had our first round of this tag team tournament. It's Owen Hart and Davey Boy versus the New Blackjacks. And you know, going back and seeing Bradshaw with a handlebar mustache kind of made me remember why I much more preferred him with a goatee. I know he and Barry were going for the Blackjack Mulligan look. It did not suit either of them. In particular, Bradshaw. It's kind of unfortunate the crowd was so dead for this, because it was a pretty good match overall. Didn't go all that long, but the work was fine. It was a combination of them not giving it enough time and the fact that the Blackjack gimmick wasn't over. That's what hurt it. I think the other thing, too, is that it was heel versus heel, which explained why the crowd was so disinterested. Because who the hell were they supposed to cheer for? Predictably, Owen and Davey won after they stacked up Bradshaw at the end. Also, probably a good time to note that Owen and Davey advanced to the next round of a tournament that up to this point, we still don't even know who all is competing in this thing. How many teams are a part of it? Who are the participants? Maybe putting up a graphic or explaining who all the teams are before you begin the tournament? Just some food for thought. After that, they replayed all the stuff that went down with the Nation on TV last week. And since we didn't review Raw the other week because of the pay-per-view recap, I'll go ahead and touch on this briefly. During a six-man with Crush, Savio, and Farouk versus Ahmed and the Road Warriors, Crush and Savio had another one of their little spouts, which cost the Nation the match and Farouk's patience, because he ended up coming out later that night to fire Crush, Savio, and Clarence Mason for some unknown reason. And he said that this week we're going to get to see the new Nation, and it'll take place in a match between Ahmed and The Undertaker. So that took us to Taker and Paul Bear's inset, where I was fully convinced that the only purpose for them shooting this live was to see if Paul could get Taker to break kayfabe. Spoiler, he did not. But Paul was extra wacky during this interview. Like, he was hamming up the gimmick to the point where there's no way he wasn't trying to get Taker to laugh. Absolutely nothing of substance was said, but Paul's goofy animated facial expressions were so amazing. And all the while, Taker's just standing there with his hands on his hips, doing everything to keep a straight face. It's a rib as old as time. The constant attempts over the years of guys trying to make the Undertaker break character on camera. I mean, we've seen a few moments where he was doing the lip scratch thing with his finger, trying to hide obvious smirks. But this is what made Taker an all-time great, man. Even his friends couldn't get him to break. He was too professional. We also had a Triple H and Chyna inset where they showed Chyna flexing her bicep muscle for the camera. It was a huge bicep. Bigger than mine. One could argue a little unnatural for the average female body. And that was... well, it wasn't really a setup per se. We did get Hunter versus Phineas Godwin in a short, boring squash. Right before the bell, Chyna manhandled some geek who was responsible for holding onto Hunter's robe. And when I say manhandle, I mean she gently nudged him to the ground. And the guy had to sell it like he got shoved by Andre the Giant. Aside from that, there was nothing remotely exciting that happened here. It was every Triple H match you've seen since 1995. He hit all his signature moves, sold for a little bit during the comeback at the end. And then Chyna distracted Phineas by planting a kiss on him. Then Hunter won with a pedigree. And then for reasons that I cannot explain, nor do I have any recollections of, who should come out but Henry Godwin? He marched down to the ring to lambaste Phineas for being a goddamn idiot and letting a woman molest him to cost him a match. And... okay, beyond the obvious stupidity of everything I just said in that previous statement, you might remember that little situation that happened on TV, say, about a month ago, when the Road Warriors broke Henry Godwin's neck doing a doomsday device. The neck injury that supposedly put Henry on the shelf for months. Yeah, well, he's just back. And not only is he back, he seems perfectly fine. Like, he's still obviously not healthy enough to wrestle, but he was getting real physical in there with Phineas. And some of you might know this, but neck injuries, kind of a big deal. Normally when someone gets a neck injury, they're out of action for at least 6 months to a year. Bare minimum. Henry Godwin landed on the back of his neck and severed multiple vertebrae. That was 1 month ago. And he is back teasing a feud with his tag team partner. Presumably as a heel. Can anybody explain what the fuck is going on here? Does this actually ever go anywhere, or is it completely fruitless? I don't have the mental capacity to let this play out. I must know the answer to this immediately. Because it makes virtually no sense. Unless Henry Godwin was fucking Iron Man, there's no logical reason he should be back on TV getting ready to set up a program with Phineas. That is fundamentally impossible if he actually broke his neck. Which I'm like, 99.9% sure was not a kayfabed injury. Oh my God. Anyway, we had Farouk informing us that the new members of the Nation tonight will be as follows: bigger, badder, stronger, and blacker. Well then, nothing really to elaborate on there. Hopefully they'll be blacker than Crush. Not too difficult a task. And then we came back for a rather interesting segment here on Raw. A segment that was sort of a hodgepodge of multiple interpromotional dealings going on. What they billed as a USWA versus ECW brand match. It's Brian Christopher versus Chris Candido. Now, a couple things I should note here before we address what went down in the segment. First of all, they had Sonny come out to do the ring intros here. From what I recall, and don't quote me on this, it's been almost 30 years since I've reviewed this timeline. I'm pretty sure, however, that Tammy and Chris were still a pair, even though she was getting a little chummy with a lot of the boys in the WWF locker room around this time. The village town bicycle, if you will, where all the boys were supposedly getting a turn. Whether she and Chris were still actually together at this point, this still had to have been an awkward moment for poor Chris. Was having to hear Sonny introduce him while she was secretly taking passes at guys like Shawn Michaels. It's just an unfortunate predicament to be in. Second thing, they had Paul Lee out there doing color commentary. I believe at the time this Raw aired, ECW had already aired the pay-per-view where they had Lawler show up and do the angle with the main event guys. I don't remember all the details of what happened, but I know they had Lawler do a run-in at the end. I think Cornette might have also been involved. Actually, now that I think of it, wasn't that the ECW show where Candido managed to convince JC to show up, with the expectation being that Paul would do a favor for him and apologize to Dennis Coralluzzo after all that shit that went down with Shane Douglas and the NWA World title in '94? I think this is the pay-per-view Cornette was referring to. Well, in any case, Paul was out there to do some promotional advertising for the next big ECW event in July. The one Lawler actually worked when he teamed up with RVD and Sabu. Don't ask me who they wrestled. Again, wasn't a huge ECW fanatic growing up, so memories are very slim. But again, this is all part of that working agreement that Vince and Paul had going on, dating all the way back to February, when they first shot the angle where Lawler called out the ECW guys and tried to stir shit up with Paul on TV. They did the angle with him and Paul on Raw where they shot back and forth on each other. It was a little too insider for my money. But the key here is they did all of that stuff at the beginning of the year, and then the entire feud went radio silent for months. There was little to no mention about anything ECW related up through WrestleMania. And now here, completely out of nowhere, they're back to revisiting the program, while at the same time having ECW stars show up for cold matches in front of a WWF audience. Now, for guys like me, who obviously knew who Chris Candido and Brian Christopher were prior to seeing them show up here, even in the case of someone like Brian, I mean, I had only really known the name prior to ever actually seeing him work in the WWF. I didn't ever really go back to see a whole lot of his Memphis stuff until years later. You can imagine, though, what the majority of the audience thought when they saw two random underneath guys work a cold match in the middle of Raw. And I don't mean that as a direct shot at either guy, but that's kind of the harsh reality of what we're dealing with here. And this is before they even brought in Brian Christopher as a regular and had him actually signed to a deal. You know, at least with a guy like Candido, some people may have remembered seeing him when he was doing the Body Donis thing with Tom Pritchard. So he was a semi-recognizable face. For a lot of the audience, though, they had never seen Brian Christopher at all. So to them, he was a nobody. Even though most people now know that he was Lawler's son. All in all, there were just a lot of things being thrown out there here, and it seemed to be catered more toward the hardcore fan base than anything. And even then, how many hardcores are actually watching the USWA in the late 90s? Only the committed ones. It was a good match, too. That's a sad thing. It did kind of piss me off that Vince completely neglected any of Chris's previous work when he was signed to the WWF a couple years back. Like at one point, he tried to have Paul fill him in on Chris's wrestling background. To which I just responded with, "Really, dude? You should know, fucker. You signed him to a contract back in 1995. What a dope. Just a clueless moron. So they're out there having a technically proficient wrestling match that nobody's reacting to or cares about. Because why should they? And it eventually boils over when Paul starts mentioning that Brian was Jerry Lawler's actual son. And what sent Lawler over the edge was Paul saying that he never acknowledged Brian on Memphis TV and how he was embarrassed to call him his son. So Lawler showed up to try to fuck over Paul by getting involved and throwing Chris off the top rope for the automatic disqualification. That led to him, Brian, and RVD coming in to stomp a mud hole in Chris until Tommy Dreamer ran out to make the save of the chair. Yeah, there were just a lot of moving parts here. And honestly, it's stuff that I don't even really care to dive deeper into from an historical perspective. Not because I'm not interested, it's just not something I'm very well equipped to expand on. But we did talk about it. The WWF versus ECW thing was such a blimp on the radar. Most fans probably don't even remember it ever happened, much less all the details of what went down. Kind of like what happened in '98 with the whole botched NWA invasion, which even less people probably know about. This is the same exact kind of stuff I used to complain about with AEW. All these random names popping up from out of the woodwork to do run-ins and angles, and like they would shoot stuff on TV that was designed to build up or touch on feuds that were going on in different promotions at the time, and nothing was ever properly followed up on. But like the expectation is we, the audience, are already in the loop of what's going on and why guys are mad at each other. It was just too niche and too insider. Problem for me is most of the time I can never figure out who the fucking baby faces or heels were, much less trying to figure out what the issue was. At least they've been consistent with the Lawler versus Heyman feud. Although it's still a bizarre rivalry to me. The idea that Lawler, who's mainly been a heel on TV as it is, like he's the one sort of directing traffic in this ongoing WWF versus ECW story. And I think Paul E's technically supposed to be the heel. They are considered the invaders. So, naturally, wouldn't they be the bad guys? Even though Lawler's technically teaming with the other ECW guys to feud with other ECW guys. You see why I can't keep track of any of this shit? It's too much. And I've spent way too long covering all of this. Forgive me for being too much of an analyst. I'll make up for it briefly by touching on this Ahmed promo. He sputtered words, and I have no idea what the hell he said. Ready to move on? Good. Then we had Goldust versus Jim Neidhart in an absolutely god-awful, horrendous TV match. I wish I could figure out how to describe Neidhart's bumping, man. It was like he was under the impression that if he took any kind of flat back bump, he would either disintegrate or sever a tailbone. I know they didn't have Neidhart work many matches in 1997. Christ, he was around for what? Less than a year before he got released and went to WCW? Where he was also terrible in the ring and looked like he was wrestling underwater most of the time. I mean, his offense looked comically bad in this match. It's like he was trying to work a parody of old school WWF cartoon style matches from the mid-80s. Not realizing it was 1997 and none of that shit was going to get over. And here's the best part. After he and Bulldog spent like 3 minutes on the floor beating him up 2-on-1, referee having to stand there arguing with Marlena interminably, he throws Goldust back into the ring. And I believe in the very next spot, Neidhart goes to shoot him off. Goldust gives him a palm strike to the jaw. And then he stacked him up and pinned him. Jim Neidhart was defeated via thrust to the face. It was made even funnier by them completely fucking up afterward. And instead of playing Goldust music, they played the Hart Foundation's music. A bad segment. At least we got Steve Austin versus Brian Pillman at the top of the hour. This is a must-needed change of pace. If they would have saved this for the main event, I don't think I would have made it. I'll even do you the solid of overlooking the ridiculous handcuff stipulation, just for the sake of belaboring talking points from earlier. I would not call this a clean, wholesome fight. Up to this point, it was by far the most exciting thing on the entire show. I do have to say, even though I hated the visual of the Hart Foundation being handcuffed to the ring posts, Owens sitting on the apron at one point trying to break free and then complaining to the official, that was at least good comedy. But of course it was Owen. I mean, there was nobody else like him that could deliver great comedic timing. The work here was stiff though. Made it look like two guys trying to go out there and beat the hell out of one another. In the case of Pillman, he did get the hell beaten out of him. Right before the commercial pitch, they did a spot where Pillman tried to run down Austin with a chair on the floor. And Austin ended up charging at him and shoving the chair right back into Pillman's fucking nose. Busted him open real bad. Came back and the announcers were talking about how Pillman has obviously sustained a broken nose. Sure as hell looked like it. It was a gnarly stinger. I also got a kick out of Austin doing the wimpy clubbing blows to the heels on the floor. While they were completely defenseless, Austin went over to Neidhart, Bulldog, and Owen and just started wailing away on him. It was phony as fuck, but I think Austin might have just been trying to rib him. Anyway, I'll skip to the end and talk about the finish, which was also very silly, but not entirely as ridiculous. So as Austin had Pillman pinned in the corner, he and Brian Hebner got into an altercation about illegal punches. So Austin just drops Hebner like a bad habit and kills him with a stunner. An absolutely horrendous bump he took for it. And of course, he conveniently gets laid out in the corner so Owen can pick his pocket and steal the key to the handcuffs, which leads to all members of the Hart Foundation freeing themselves and getting involved for the DQ. So again, reverting back to my comments earlier, why didn't they just bar everybody from ringside under penalty of suspension? No idea. Apparently that would have been too smart. It's pro wrestling. We don't do smart in wrestling. You know, unless you're Eddie Graham, Bill Watts, Jerry Jarrett, or any sensible promoter who actually cared about attention to detail. And so as the heels are beating down Austin, out empties the cavalry from the back to help make the save. Again. This time we had the Road Warriors, Goldust, Ken Shamrock, and Mankind. And for the second straight occasion that a collection of babyfaces tried to bail Austin out of a jam, he repays them kindly by flipping everybody the bird and then getting into a fight with Shamrock again. Which leads to, of all people, Goldust being the voice of reason, as he gets on the stick and says, "We've all got a common enemy. And since the Hart Foundation won 5 of the best the WWF has to offer, ain't no better 5 men than the ones that are currently standing in the ring right now." Debatable. And so that apparently is how they set up the 5-on-5 tag match for the Calgary pay-per-view. They had 5 random babyfaces come out to do a runoff with the Hart Foundation in a TV angle. And then Goldust said, "Hey, check this out. We got 5 men. The heels have 5 men. Guess it's settled." Meanwhile, everybody else was very much ambivalent about it. Everyone except Austin, who basically said, "Fuck all y'all. I'll do this as a one-off, but after the pay-per-view, you can all eat shit." Keep this in mind, too. Mankind was initially involved in that save. Somewhere along the way, he completely vanished from this segment. So in actuality, it was technically 6-on-5. But Mankind disappeared from the equation with no explanation and was never factored into the decision when Goldust did the promo to announce the match. Which I know plays into everything they're doing in storyline with him and Austin. But still, that was a weird way to phase Foley out of the picture. I don't know what happened to him. He was there, and then he just vanished. The 5 of the best WWF has to offer, huh? Goldust, the Road Warriors, Ken Shamrock, and Steve Austin. I will most definitely concur with Austin being among those top names. The other 4, I don't know about all that. I'm a big Road Warriors fan, but their 1997 run, not exactly what I would call the best. They never thought to factor in The Undertaker in all this. You know, the current reigning WWF champion. Would he not qualify as one of the best in the WWF as of this point? Maybe their thought was, fuck it, the Hart Foundation's going to be over in Canada anyway. May as well not try to get all of our top babyfaces booed. Oh, by the way, on the topic of comedic timing from earlier, when I was mentioning the Owen Hart spot with the handcuffs, here's another great bit of comedy. The Hart Foundation informing us that Canada is all about fair and equal opportunity, that they don't discriminate. Right. Yeah. Canada, they're all about freedom and liberty. Unless you're a heterosexual white male with moderate to conservative political leanings, then at that point you may as well be the spawn of Satan. Tell people that are proponents of guns that you're not discriminated against if you go to Canada. See how that fucking conversation gets over. So then we get a segment that I in particular have rather fond memories of. Not so much in the way of it being good or what you would consider a turning point in the Monday Night Wars. I more so remember it for being outrageously stupid and kind of exposing the complete ineptitude when it came to the WWF around this time. And especially for a guy like me who grew up watching territory wrestling and actually knew who the fucking Fantastics were by the time I was old enough to see these guys work on the WWF stage. I mean, this just made me sour on everything even more. Now, I talked about the Brian Christopher stuff earlier. One thing I did not mention is that at the time he came up, it was also around the same time they started referencing the light heavyweight division. And I don't exactly know if this was a tournament round or if it was just one of those scouting matches. Because again, they were bringing in a lot of guys around this time and trying to figure out who to use. So I think this is just kind of like a tryout deal. But this is the Raw where they quote-unquote debuted the light heavyweight division, so to speak, in very half-assed WWF fashion as it would be. I don't know who spearheaded the idea. Somebody decided along the way, we need to counteract the cruiserweight division and do something similar to compete. And thus the light heavyweight division was born. And again, because the WWF wasn't actually committed to the idea of it, and they didn't bother to actually establish what the division was or what its purpose would be, well, we ended up getting the end result, which was essentially a sum collection of relatively decent athletes that were anywhere between 200 to 215 pounds, just going out there and doing spot matches to entertain the crowd. And while I wouldn't necessarily consider that a bad thing, especially for the kind of culture that wrestling was adapting to during the late 90s, the reality was it wasn't ever a division they dedicated a whole lot of time to or treated as anything beyond prelim material. The thing that sucks too is if you actually go back, the light heavyweight division stems from a partnership that WWF had back in the 80s with the UWA out of Mexico. Eventually they ended up rebranding as something else later on. In the actual physical belt, I think I'm correct about this, didn't that belt get used in Japan in Sasake's promotion before it became official property of the WWF here in the States? So there was actually a bit of lineage to this thing dating back a decade prior. Now, none of that was ever talked about on commentary in detail because, well, again, they didn't give a fuck. And then we had this match here between Fulton and Rogers. Again, I knew who these guys were. You all probably knew who these guys were. Did the WWF audience, by and large, know who they were? Probably not. To them, it was just two jabroni balonies out there having another cold match for no reason. They never bothered to explain how these two came in. I believe it was Cornette who called them and told them about this whole concept. Got them a reasonable payday out of it for the one fucking date they actually worked. But then they had these guys out there wrestling each other. Bobby Fulton's a fucking heel for no reason. He had the most ridiculous ring gear on. He's also a brunette again after he dyed his hair back. Just looked completely generic. He was about 30 pounds heavier since the last time we saw him on a national stage. Tommy Rogers always looked reasonably good. He was in naturally great shape anyway. They got about 2 or 3 minutes to work with. And the only reason any of this was actually salvaged was because JR knew enough about their history to do a reasonably good job getting them over. Guarantee you Vince had no fucking clue who they were. So they had a short TV match that got over like a wet fart in church. Tommy Rogers won with Christian Cage's old finish. And then not even 5 seconds after they scored the victory, they immediately threw up a graphic to plug, of all fucking matches, Jerry Lawler and RVD versus the goddamn Headbangers. What a load. By the way, this was a tournament round. Dear God. The idea that one of these two teams could have qualified to face Stone Cold and Mick Foley for the World Tag Belts. I think I would have rather seen that fucking Goldust Jim Neidhart match again. Or better yet, I could just down an entire bottle of bleach and put myself out of my misery. Just to ensure I don't dwell on the mediocrity. It was a bad match. RVD did a lot of showboaty, crowd-pleasing offense, despite that I think he's supposed to be a heel. Tommy Dreamer and Paulie were sitting at ringside scouring. Then after things broke down, Lawler gave one of the Headbangers a pile driver, which immediately led to the Sandman hitting the ring and scraping a kendo stick over Lawler's testicles. This led to the Headbangers winning with some kind of weird-looking top rope-assisted gourd buster. At least they ditched their previous finish. Mosh, I believe, was wearing rainbow-colored spandex under his kilt. This did not make him look any less gay and or ridiculous. And then we had the ECW guys getting into a quick shoving match at ringside, which ultimately led to nothing. This sucked dick. Which honestly, I could probably just tag this entire episode that WWF Raw is War. This sucked dick. Don't know if that would pass the sniff test with YouTube's algorithms. Might have to settle with something less vulgar. But let's turn our attention to the TV main event. The Undertaker and Ahmed Johnson versus Farouk and his Mystery Man. The first of two new additions to the Nation of Domination. And I'm talking about Kama Mustafa. You also may remember him as the future Godfather and or the former Papa Shango. I always forget about this. We actually had seen Kama around dating back to 96 when he was doing the Street Fighter gimmick on TV for a while. It was kind of a unmemorable run, but remember, didn't he steal the Undertaker's urn at one point and melt it down into a necklace? Remember that whole saga that went on for months and never really had a proper resolution? Well, I guess you could call this a resolution of sorts. Taker finally got his revenge after over a year and a half. Kinda. So, this is one of those matches where if you couldn't tell the direction it was headed before the bell even rang, I don't know what to tell you. Must have not been watching wrestling all that long to know when a swerve was coming. In essence, here's what we had. We had The Undertaker getting his ass beat for practically the entire match while Ahmed stood on the apron doing nothing. Because obviously with where they were going at the finish, they couldn't have Ahmed get physically involved with the Nation, because that would have killed the whole thing. So instead, we had to watch The Undertaker work the entire match by himself, only to then get pinned in the middle of the ring by Kama with an out-of-nowhere belly-to-belly suplex. And it was so out of nowhere, I sneezed, and when I looked up, Kama and Farouk had their hands raised while The Undertaker was laying flat on his back selling in the middle of the ring. Also, we could get the big twist where even though Ahmed did nothing to voluntarily affect the outcome of this match, even though there was never an angle or a spot prior to where he refused to tag or did anything to blatantly try and cost The Undertaker the match here, Ahmed then picks up The Undertaker and he plants him with a Pearl River plunge. And then he goes up to the top of the ramp to do the Black Power fist pose with all the other Nation members. So he turned heel. Which leads me to think that there was only one knucklehead responsible for everything that went down here, because it defied all sense of rational thought or coherence. This is where Russo never got it when it came to booking. Beyond just all the bad ideas and numerous dumb concepts he came up with during his time, the simple issue of him always being a reactionary kind of booker, never taking into account intricacies, never thinking about the small details in between that go into piecing together a concept or an angle or an idea. No, he only cared about the end result. He only cared about the actual moment itself. Not the why, how, when, or what scenarios. This is all key. These are not trivial details I'm mentioning here. Think about how idiotic this all came off. The Undertaker, the World Wrestling Federation champion, by the way, not only did he get punked out by the Nation in a 7-minute TV match, clean in the middle of the ring, like an absolute job guy, at the same time, there really wasn't anything that led up to it where you could argue Taker got massively fucked over. In actuality, he didn't. He voluntarily worked the entire match on his own. He never made any attempts at tagging in or trying to get Ahmed in there to bail him out. He was essentially beaten and disposed of like absolute garbage. And Ahmed didn't have to do a God-blessed thing. And it wasn't until after the Nation had already done the damage to where Ahmed came in and said, okay, now is the point where I will reveal myself as the newest Nation member. After I didn't do jack shit to contribute to helping out my boys, and I basically served as being an absolute worthless teammate. All the while, we've already completely undersold the fact that Kama isn't a member of the Nation as well. Because that's another key factor. The big blow-off here was Ahmed as a member of the Nation. And we completely forgot that Kama was also just recently added to the group. See, this is what I mean when I say Russo never paid attention to finesse. These are pretty big glaring holes. Things that really should not be looked over during booking meetings. I will give them this. It is a far, far better collection of talent pool already compared to what they had previously. Even with the inclusion of Ahmed Johnson. Like, I still don't know what the hell they were going for with that initial core assortment of dudes, but glad to see they finally moved on from it. And we still haven't even gotten The Rock on board yet. Like, that's when this faction really turns around for the better. But the reveal of Ahmed at the end, it was so poorly thought out. Like, at the very least, you couldn't have given The Undertaker an outing here. All they had to do was have Ahmed come in and finish The Undertaker off before the Nation got the pinfall. Like, that would have at least made more sense. And you know, I'll say this about the Ahmed thing. You all know what I think of him. The WWF crowd, for some ungodly reason, there was a major cult of personality when it came to Ahmed fandom. He was massively over. And you gotta think, when they turned him heel and had him join the Nation, kind of killed his gimmick. He lost a lot of mystique as a result. I don't think that people ever viewed him the same way afterward. And from what I remember, him and the Nation didn't even last all that long, right? What was it, a couple months later they just turned him back face and had him feuding with the Nation again once they brought The Rock on board? By that point, I don't really think that people cared to see it. They lost interest. This just circulates under that umbrella of ongoing booking issues with the WWF during this time. Like, even if you want to say they had a plan by turning Ahmed heel and aligning him with the group, what good came out of it? It's not like he ever would have stood out on his own. Not with Farouk being the ringleader. At that stage, Ahmed was just another guy in a group of angry black men. So even if he stayed heel longer, I don't think it would have done him any favors. This Raw didn't do anybody any favors. It was a sucky program. Another 2 hours of me going back and seeing how my childhood massively steered me wrong. It's funny how things are so much more compelling when you're young and stupid, and your brain hasn't fully developed yet. All the stuff we used to rave about as kids growing up, used to think is so awesome. I don't know about you all, but this WWF period in 1997 really blows chunks. Maybe I just have way too high of standards. Perhaps I prefer my wrestling to make sense, as opposed to the let's throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what works kind of approach, which is very much the style of booking we're seeing here with the WWF. Yeah, Shawn leaving kind of threw a monkey wrench into everything, but even excluding the stuff he was involved with, this light heavyweight division crap, the ECW versus WWF saga that's never been properly developed on TV, random names popping up with no fanfare. Is it any wonder Nitro was the popular TV show at the time? I don't know. Anyway, I gotta get out of here because I gotta get to church and do some of that drumming and singing stuff. So, I want to thank everybody for coming back to check out the show, and I'll catch y'all this coming Friday for the Retro WCW and Mid-South timeline, and we'll just keep moving through things as we go forward. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take care and peace out.